Then Ishbi-Benob, who was one of the sons of the giants, the weight of whose bronze spear was 300 shekels, so about half the weight of Goliath, nonetheless quite large, who was bearing a new sword, thought he could kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swore to him, saying, You shall go out no more with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel. Now they saw the importance of him as a leader at that point. They didn't want to risk him being killed or hurt, obviously. It goes on to say, so that's one other giant. It says, now it happened afterward that there was again a battle with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Houghtonite killed Saph, who was one of the sons of the giant. Again there was a war, so that was two. So again there was a war at Gob with the Philistines. There Elhanan, the son of Jehoiarib, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath, the Gittite. So there's up to three. And it says again here, the shaft of whose spear was like the weaver's beam. So it brings out that description again. In verse 20, yet again there was war at Gath. There was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. And he was also born of the giant. So when he defied Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimei, this would be David's brother, killed that giant. These 4 were born to the giants in Gath and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. 5 giants get mentioned there. Now we bring you back to 1 Samuel, and you'll just turn the page from where we were with a description of Goliath. And picking up 1 Samuel 17, verse 40. This is talking about David. It says, so then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself how many stones? 5. 5 smooth stones from the brook. Put them in the shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. Now, there is no direct Bible evidence that he chose 5 stones because there were 5 giants. But it seems interesting to me that he chose 5 stones and there were 5 giants. Some would ask, why, when he chose 5 stones, was that representing that he didn't have enough faith for the battle before him? After all, it was whose battle? It was the Lord's battle. So why choose 5 stones? Some would say, well, that's just good common sense. If you're going to go into battle, you better load up the quiver. But I would say, even if there's not a direct connection between those 5 stones and those 5 giants, I would say that David had an abundance of faith. If nothing else, those giants representing the enemy against the Lord's army was trying to squash the lineage. The enemy knew that through that lineage of Judah and David, and if you go to the first chapter of Matthew, it lays it right out, all the way to Jesus himself. And it was definitely a battle of faith. Now it goes on to say, and this is the other thing, do you recall how long, see if any of the Barnes kids get this, do you remember how long Goliath challenged the army of Israel? Does that ring a bell? How many days did Goliath stand in front of the army? Did they say it? They're whispering it? Okay, 40? Yeah, 40 days. 40 days. Now it's interesting how that number 40 comes up, and how these different numbers appear scripturally. You think about there was 40 days of rain in Noah's time. There was 40 days to embalm Joseph. There were Moses 40 days on the mountain. The spies of Israel went into the promised land for how many days? 40 days. That turned into a symbolic number because it became 40 years that they traveled in the wilderness, so actually a generation that 40 years represented. We know here Goliath stood before the Israel army for 40 days, challenging them. Elijah was 40 days in the desert. Jonah predicted the destruction of Nineveh, 40 days. We can understand that Jesus fasted for 40 days, and then he spent 40 days after the resurrection with the disciples. So I don't know what the complete significance of 40 days is, but it does seem like there's a waiting period. There's this time of waiting and anticipation. As David stood up, as he saw that Israel's army was being challenged, that the God of Israel, the Creator God, the Almighty, was being offended every single day. When he took to the battle, no one could say, "Oh, I was about to do that." They had plenty of time to demonstrate who they were, what they were, from the smallest to the greatest of them. And yet here a shepherd comes in. He hears it once, and he steps to the call. Well, as we read on here, I'm going to continue in verse 41. So the Philistines came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth. He was Arlie. He was Arlie, standing before that. It says here that David was ruddy, he was good looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods, lowercase g. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David has a response. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you," how? How does he come to him? "In the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And then David goes on to basically explain how God's going to win the battle for Israel in some detail. I skip down to verse 48. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and he ran toward the army. Now I stopped there for a second because this is something that I really hadn't seen. Isn't it interesting? You can read these stories and they're almost cliche. We've heard them since our earliest days. And I always knew he ran, but I thought he ran to Goliath. But here it says he ran to the army. Now you think about that. He went to meet the Philistine, and you can imagine him seeing that Philistine, but there was an army. Earlier we can see the size of the army. This is no small army. Puts it in perspective. And we know how it ends. Indeed, God guided that rock and struck down the Philistine, and it was a victory for God's army. Now, I asked a little while ago about bravery versus courage. And if you were to look at today's English definition, understanding of bravery, it's something like this: often an instinctive reaction, a quick moment of facing fear, a quality of a person that allows someone to do things that are dangerous. You can check that box for David. It has a possibility of physical harm. You can check that box for David. He exhibited, by that definition, bravery. There's enough of us in here that are old enough to remember back to 1982. It was a flight that departed one of the DC airports, and it was a combination of, it wasn't de-iced properly, it was in January, it was snowing something fierce. They had a delay on the ramp of about 2 hours, but they didn't de-ice it properly. Apparently there was some pilot error, and they came off the runway, didn't have time to stop, so they tried to get going. They clipped a bridge. They ended up in the Potomac. Do you remember that? Now, I had to look up some of those details because I didn't remember. But I was about 13 when that happened. And while I had to look up those details, one thing I didn't have to look up, because I remember watching the CBS News and Dan Rather and all this reporting going on, and there's ice, huge chunks of ice floating down the Potomac. In fact, it was almost as if the airplane broke up some of that ice. So the rescue efforts were incredibly difficult, incredibly difficult. People were killed on the road, by the way. I mean, the airplane smashed cars. It was a terrible scene. Of the, there were 70-some people on the airplane, like 5, just a handful, survived this. And the ones that survived were in the water, and there was a National Parks helicopter nearby that was able to hover over these icy waters, dropping a line with a life ring on it. And all they can do is get it down there because they don't have hoisting capability, but the people would grab on, they're numb and they're freezing, and then the helicopter would drag them kind of over to the shore where the rescue workers were there to receive them. But there's this lady, and she's holding on for everything she can, but she's too weak. She's failing, and she falls short of the shoreline. And there's a guy. He just dives in, and he swims out to her, and he drags her into shore. You know, he didn't wake up that day thinking, well, I'm going to plan this out. It was a moment. I would say that's bravery. God inspired David. Now, courage, this would be the definition today in our English language, involves conscious effort and planning, even in the face of fear, mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. This might be something that in the Christian world we would talk about as conviction. While it's maybe not as instantaneous as bravery, you can see how the two really complement each other. And I did a search on a concordance for bravery in the Bible, and there wasn't a word. It didn't show up. But when I put in courage or courageous, 26 times, 26 mentions in the Bible. You see courage all over, strewn throughout the scriptures. And for us today, it could be speaking up against corruption. It could be speaking against bullying, advocating for others. Could be courageous forgiving others. And when we talked earlier about, can you tell me of these characters who may represent courage? Karina, you brought up one that came to mind. And so we're going to go there. It's Daniel chapter 3. We could just plug Daniel in there. No problem there. Daniel chapter 3. Verse 15. And if I were to go back to the heading of chapter 3, it's the image of gold. So we know the story of Nebuchadnezzar putting that image of gold there, and everybody was to bow down to it when they heard the music. That's the crux of the story. But the way that these youth responded, we could just talk about it, but really reading it, I think there's something to be gained to refresh our memories. So we start in verse 15. Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. Who's talking there? Nebuchadnezzar. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who would deliver you from my hands? I don't think there's a more powerful response in all of Scripture than what these youth share. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning, fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. To convert the three young worthies to pagan worship. That to me is courage, the way they stood up. This was conviction. It was something that they had in their quiver as Christians. It goes on to say, by the way, in verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace, how much? I don't know how you measure that, but it's raging. And you'd envision these large furnaces perhaps to what, bake clay, stones, and so on. These are big furnaces. 7 times hotter. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's one fire, but it has 2 different results. When Jesus comes in his glory, it's the same glory with 2 different results. There's a consuming glory or consuming fire that lays those who rejected him low. And then there's this saving result of his glory from, instead of a consuming fire, we might even say it's a guiding light. When you think about what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were going through, I wonder about myself. If I was, or if you were, if we were going through a trial, if you and I were standing trial, accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict us? I pray that there would be. Now, bravery and courage, I think, have a common point. And it's this. It's substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. What's that the definition of? It's faith. And if we were going to talk about faith, what book and chapter would we go to? It's known as the faith chapter, Hebrews 11. I always have a hard time finding it because it's further back in the Bible than I always think about. And Hebrews 11 goes through all the patriarchs and the prophets. Then you get up to verse 30. Hebrews 11, verse 30. It says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon. So this comes back to our discussion earlier. We include some of those judges, and of Barak and Samson, that was mentioned, of Jephthah. It says here also of David. So he's a key component during David's time, wasn't he, Samuel? And the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Well, there's only one that's better, and we all want to be a part of that. 36, still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, this is something, sawn in two. They were tempted, were slain with a sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through what? In faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Verse 12, verse 1, it says, therefore. So it doesn't stop there. It continues into the next chapter. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher. And I come back to our children's story, when Jesus is that connecting agent from earth to heaven. And the fact that it says author, to me, that says he's the creator of that faith. So we shouldn't even look at it in the sense that that's something that I have to do to develop faith. He is the author. He has given us a measure. And then it says he is the finisher. He perfects that faith in us. The work is his. We need to turn our lives over to him, submit to him, surrender to him. So it says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Bravery, courage, and faith. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind.